Mr. Babich, how much do we know now with the latest about this suspect? Any specific information regarding why he is doing what he did in the metro station?
Well, right now we just know that there is a suspect. His name is Akbarzhon Jalilov. He was 22 years old. He came to Russia with his parents when he was 16, just 5 years ago. He got Russian citizenship. It is pretty easy for Central Asians, people from the former republics of the Soviet Union in Central Asia. It's pretty easy for them to get Russian citizenship. And the official version is that most likely he got radicalized. It is interesting that it was not the Russian authorities who divulged the identity of the suspect. We first heard it from the Kyrgyz authorities, which immediately started questioning, the suspect's parents. What do they notice about their son? Were there any signs of his radicalization? So it's very nice that the Kyrgyzstan authorities are cooperating with Russia in this affair. I think it's still too early to make any conclusions, but it's clear that it was a terrorist act. And most likely it was, the criminal had Islamist convictions.
Right.
Whether he acted alone or whether he was spurred to do it by the Islamic State or by some other radical organization, we don't know. Technically, it was possible for him to act alone because he just made one explosion and left the other device, which, thank God, was diffused by the policemen and never killed anyone.
That's right. Professor Fedyashin, I want to continue about questions in that regard. As a result of the revealing of information coming from Kyrgyzstan first, and the apparent already cooperation between Russia and Kyrgyzstan about the suspect, how much do you think that can reveal to us the relations between these two governments, and particularly in a way reflect Russia's relations with some of the Central Asian countries?
Well, Russia's relation with the Central Asian countries has been a lot more functional and constructive over the past decade than it has been with the governments of Western countries, unfortunately. So the issue here is really a question of sort of identifying these lone wolf suspects and tracing the evolution of their radicalization, if that's in fact what happened here. So far, the Russians have been cooperating with the Central Asians fairly well. So the question is, can any of this kind of activity be prevented? And that's really the key to understanding how to control and prevent terrorism. And this is something that all countries struggle with, both in the West, as we've seen in London and Paris and Belgium, and in the United States. So it is a common struggle, and the entire world needs to come together.
Ms. He, while we are watching the tragic incident here from China, what do these specific incidents tell us about the preparedness in Russia against any kinds of terror attacks, and from the responses almost immediate in Russia about their preparedness to face up to these kind of incidents? And also, the next question, of course, is Russia's relations with some of the Central Asian countries, as I put forward to some of the other panelists earlier.
Well, of course, as our colleagues has mentioned, any terror attack towards any country, of course, that's a part of the global, I think, terror issue. So also calls upon the cooperation between all those countries. So in China as well, we are also facing those terrorist groups like acting in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Also, even in other cities like Kunming, years ago, there is terrorist group. They have also did very terrified terror attack. So, but when we look about the detailed things happening in this subway in St. Petersburg, I think we need to analyze some other facts. For example, this is happened to be when the President Putin was in his hometown in St. Petersburg, and they even had a meeting not far from that subway station, had this explosion. So I think it's very political motivated activity. So it's targeting to the even President Putin himself, his schedule. He wants to disrupt his schedule. And also, when we relate this with all those things happening, like in the Syria war, because Russia has been involved in the the terror activity in Syria war for a number of years, and also some homegrown, like this, the suspects has tell us, those homegrown, those wolf, those lonely wolf people, so they are quite radical. So in Russia, there are homegrown, those radical groups as well.
We do not know yet about many of the details to make judgment at this point, but Mr. Babich, does this in a way make a threat almost to the government of Russia and also to President Putin himself? Or this is likely more a coincidence?
Cause of this terrorist attack, because that is not in Putin's character to bow to pressure. And I would like to agree with our American participant that all countries, all civilized countries should stand together against terrorism. We should all understand that there is no real confrontation, for example, between Sunni and Shia Muslims. The real confrontation is between the huge majority of Muslims who are law-abiding, nice, kind people, and the small radicalized minority which is present in the United States, in Western Europe, in Russia, in China. And unfortunately, this small radicalized minority sometimes uses the contention that we have between ourselves, that we have with the United States, that we have with the European Union. And I would say that, for example, in Libya and in Syria, unfortunately, the Islamists managed to use our differences to their own advantage. So when we have this terrorist attack in St. Petersburg, please notice that some media in the world are not quite sympathetic with Russia. They say that this is a defeat for Putin, that Putin is to blame himself, Russia is to blame himself. That means playing into the hands of these people, of the radicalized Muslims.
I think we can put the rhetorics aside, at least for now, and take a look at the real picture. In the past several decades, terror attacks hit Russia with alarming frequency, especially those carried out by the Chechen independence movement. If we take a look at some of the historic footages, in December 2013, twin bombings at the train station and on a bus in the southern city of Russia killed more than 30 people. January 2011, a suicide attack at an international airport near Moscow killed more than 36 people. The last deadly subway attack in Russia, which hit the capital Moscow, took place on March 2010, killed at least 33 people. And people, of course, still remember the school hostage crisis in the year 2004, ending with at least 330 hostages being killed, including 186 children. These were sadly, and tragic incidents. Therefore, the question to be asked, Mr. Fedyashin, how much Russia could protect itself from terrorism, particularly from independence movements or extremism, and is Russia going to have partners in terms of fighting against these forces?
It's a fair question. First of all, it's important to distinguish between the sources of terrorism. The victims suffer regardless, of course, and every attack is a tragedy. But there is a difference between terrorist attacks that are homegrown in Russia and emerge out of independence and radicalized independence movements such as in the Caucasus. And we've seen people who come from the Caucasus also hit the United States, for example, and that's the Tsarnaev brothers and the Boston bombing. Then there is a different source of terrorism, which is homegrown radicalization, which is inspired by multinational organizations such as ISIS or Al-Qaeda. And those two different sources sort of necessitate a different approach to how to control, manage, infiltrate and keep informed of that terrorism. You know, one of the things that people who study intelligence always run up against is that intelligence organizations across the world are by definition national organizations. They serve their governments and their nation's interests. They are not naturally cosmopolitan, internationalist, globalists. So it is always a struggle to get them to work together and share information. It's just not in their DNA, although it is so important, and many strides have been made in that direction in the past 15 years, but clearly not enough. So the faster that the Western and the Eurasian governments encourage their security services to work with each other and to inform each other of these movements across borders and the money transfers and communications, clearly the better. The Russians have one more question, which is very important to answer. St. Petersburg metro system has had metal detectors and bomb detectors that have been placed there and have become active by the beginning of this year. One of the questions that's being raised in Petersburg newspapers today is how did this man get through these metal detectors with the amount of ball bearings and the circular items that he had in the bags? So another question to be answered.
There are a lot of hazards that certainly needs to be checked, but the most important question is not only about the anti-terrorism scene, but also how countries can work together. Is that going to provide an opportunity for countries to work together? Ms. He, we heard words coming from both the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and also the phone call coming from the United States, President Trump, as well as some of the other European leaders. Russia, European countries have not been on great terms. It's probably the politest way to put it. And Russia, the US, has been in intense debates about whether elections are being influenced. These are all very political issues. Will anti-terrorism bring them an opportunity together?
Yeah, could be, but I don't think this terror attack to the subway will give a fundamental change between those relations between Russia and the EU, European country, even United States, simply because the fundamental interest among themselves, I think, is quite different. Nowadays, from the perspective of European country, they still regard the Ukraine issue and the Crimea issue are the fundamental issue rather than this terror attack. But from the perspective of President Trump, I think he regards as anti-ISIL, that Islamic State is the fundamental one. So not to mention now, it's not so clear who had done this terror attack in the subway. It's from Central Asia country or it's from somewhere else. But it's certainly, I don't think it's going to be a turning point. Maybe somehow they joint effort to say anti-terror, that's it, general talking, anti-terror, but not goes to the specific which terror group they are mentioned to.
We'll see how things develop. Mr. Babich, I will also want to have your judgment here. This happened, deadly incident happened at a time when there are turbulences also inside your own country in politics. Meanwhile, we see the election coming up, 2018. What would this tragic incident mean for many of the things on the horizon is still a big question mark. Mr. Babich, President Putin was already out there laying the flowers for those who passed away in this deadly incident. Will the government be able to take this opportunity to approach the public in a way that would eventually bring closure on this incident and probably on some of the other issues as well?
Well, I don't see any particular turbulence in Russia. If we talk about the so-called youth protests a few days ago, they were not important. I covered them. It was not a major event. You know, on the same day in France or in Germany, you had much bigger protests. The election is still far away, 2018. And it is more or less clear that Putin will run, and if he runs, he will of course simply beat any other opponent. There are no figures on the political horizon that would be comparable to him. But you are right that the government is using this opportunity to become more open, to become more compassionate, if you want. Mm-hmm. For example, when this terrible situation happened in St. Petersburg, immediately there was special transportation organized for people who simply could not get home because the metro was stopped. Right. Also, the government has allowed people free rides on trains on that day, not on metro but on commuter trains that continued to function. So I think terrorism is a terrible misfortune, but sometimes it gives the government an opportunity to show its better side. Okay. Like Rudy Giuliani did it in New York City after the 9/11 disaster. So the Russian government is trying, probably on a lesser scale, but to do the same thing.